it is really important that Western countries do give the Ukrainians modern offensive equipment, such as main battle tanks, self-propelled artillery, armored infantry fighting vehicles, so they can carry the fight to the Russians and
Yes.
deliver a series of decisive strikes, which may well be aimed to break the morale of the Russian soldier, to break the backbone of the Russian. Well, you can't blame the Ukrainians for asking for all and everything. The age-old principle, I think we all understand: if you don't ask, you don't get. I think the wider point here is a recognition, and I think we've discussed it before, that there is no obvious prospect of this war being concluded by negotiation. The opening positions of Zelensky and the opening position of Putin, frankly, they're mutually irreconcilable. So I remain firmly of the view, and I think others share it as well, that this war is going to have to be decided on the battlefield. Therefore, it is inevitable and quite proper that the Ukrainians should ask for the maximum amount of modern equipment. Now, they're successful last week in breaking the logjam as far as getting modern Western main battle tanks, and they will hopefully be made available to the Ukrainians in a matter of a few weeks, or a
Mm.
matter of weeks and a few months at the most.
Yes, yes. But
Aircraft is a different issue, though, and there's a lot of talk about F-16 aircraft, which are clearly American, but there are many owned by Eastern European countries. Poland, in particular, is willing to gift them, but the Americans, rather like the Germans with the tanks, do hold the whip hand.
yes, I wonder if it may be a matter of time there before America relents on this. I mean, they had a pretty tough line on jets, and then countries including Poland and the Baltic NATO members and Finland, they put their shoulder to the wheel, argued and pressurized America to move, and America did.
Well, it's an interesting thought, but America clearly is hugely in support of Ukraine. I mean, the amount of gift aid, donations, equipment in monetary terms dwarfs anything that any single European country has given. But take the offensive capability of the Abrams tanks. They can't be delivered for many months. It may be as long as almost a year before they're delivered.
Mm.
And the same could be said of F-16 aircraft. And you have to ask yourself, why? Is America supporting Ukraine? Yes, of course, obviously, but quite happy not to put high-tech American kit into Ukrainian hands, perhaps until the war is over.
Mm.
And maybe they're thinking beyond the end of this war, which I'd like to see coming to a conclusion on the ground this year. The Americans are thinking of supporting Ukraine beyond the end of the war in terms of a deterrent posture for the future.
Well, there's another possible scenario which has been floated by Michael McFaul, who, as you know, was a former American ambassador to Russia, now a leading academic in the field of war studies. He suggested that it may be the case that America might come to supply jets to Ukraine, but on the condition that those jets are not used to strike targets on Russian territory. What would you make
Yeah.
of that by way of an arrangement?
No, well, I think this is, of course, symptomatic and very similar to the restrictions that the Americans have placed on their HIMARS, long-range, very accurate missile systems. They could have donated already ATACMS with a much longer range, but I think quite properly and quite sensibly, the Americans want to constrain the Ukrainians to win the war in Ukraine.
Hmm.
And I think this is important, that the language actually needs to start shifting. We need to be talking about this much more as a limited war, limited in geography, limited in the weapons being used, limited in the objectives, so that the Russians can't claim that this is a war of Russia against NATO, Russia against America, trying to push Russia into a corner. No, the aim, the clear strategic aim, is to free Ukraine of Russian soldiers, to let Ukraine govern its own sovereign territory. That's an important limited aim, but very significant in its own right.
Yeah, well, to that end, a supply of stronger air defence weaponry would seem to be crucial, and maybe the longer range missiles, as well as systems like the Patriot air defence weapon. Some of those are on their way to Ukraine now from America and other supportive countries, but arguably they need more.
Well, yes, they do. I mean, things like air defense systems and many of the systems that have been supplied so far have prevented the Ukrainians losing this war. That's good as far as it goes. But
Hmm.
what we absolutely have to do, if you take my point that there's no potential for a negotiated settlement, is that this war has got to be settled on the ground. So therefore, it is really important that Western countries do give the Ukrainians modern offensive equipment, such as main battle tanks, self-propelled artillery, armored infantry fighting vehicles, so they can carry the fight to the Russians and
Yes.
deliver a series of decisive strikes, which may well be aimed to break the morale of the Russian soldier, to break the backbone of the Russian army. And I think that's quite possible, particularly after the Russians mount their much expected fresh offensive,
Mm.
which, on the basis of all that we've seen so far, will probably fail. That's the moment that the Ukrainians have got to mount their Western enabled armored counteroffensive and strike some decisive blows.
Right. So on that expected coming spring offensive and counter offensive, I'd be grateful for some of your perspective on a battlefield question, because I saw a line, I was reading a line earlier today attributed to British intelligence, that there's a view in British intelligence that Russia would seek to, or could seek to, establish a new, what was called an axis of advance to divert Ukrainian forces away from Bakhmut. Could you just explain that for us in layman's terms?
Well, an axis of advance is a military term for the direction in which you want to go. It sounds a bit more fancy than that, but basically, it's the direction in which you want to go. Now, we can have fights at the tactical level, we can have strategic objectives, but in the middle of that comes what we understand to be the operational level of war, whereby you try and devise an overall scheme of maneuver that catches the enemy out, achieves some surprise. Think back to the autumn when there was a lot of talk about a Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kherson in the south. The Russians bought that. They moved some of their better units round to defend in the Kherson area. But actually, the Ukrainians then attacked on the Kharkiv front, on that axis. And that effectively achieved a degree of operational surprise. And both sides will undoubtedly, at the higher command level, be trying to figure out ways that they can catch the other side by surprise. You can do it sort of tactically with small little engagements, but trying to achieve an operational level of surprise where you wrong foot the other side's generals, that is what they're trying to do. And that is the sort of maneuver that will be required to cause a significant breakthrough. If I put my money on who's going to achieve it best, it'll be the Ukrainians and not the Russians.
That is interesting and useful context. Just on the political front, and more reports this afternoon. Boris Johnson, he's in America, apparently making the case for further aid to Ukraine at a succession of events and gatherings of the Republican Party. I wonder what you think of that. Is this a valuable effort in your eyes?
Well, you have to credit Boris. I mean, he was the cheerleader for the West right at the start. When he was Prime Minister, he carried credibility and weight of the UK behind him. Of course, he's a member of Parliament, but otherwise, in every other respect, he's a private citizen like you and I. So yes, he can address audiences, he can go and visit Zelensky in Kyiv, but he doesn't carry the weight of the UK with him. In this regard, I think he needs to be a little bit careful. Rishi Sunak is the Prime Minister, and it's he who should be setting the pace as far as the UK is concerned. And top marks to Rishi, which was the country that agreed to donate main battle tanks first. It was the UK, Prime Minister Sunak's decision. So top marks to him. I think Boris needs to be careful not to be seen as a loose cannon, and perhaps quite a potentially dangerous loose cannon.